My name is Rachel Delaney, and I'm going to tell you what happened this summer. I got pushed out of my own home by the two people who were supposed to love me most. I've told pieces of this story before. To friends, to a therapist named Dr. Carla Whitman, who works out of an office on Peachtree Road in Atlanta and who, for the record, is the reason I'm standing upright and functional today. I've told it in pieces, in the way you tell things when you're not sure how much the other person can hold, or how much you can hold in the telling. But I've never told the whole thing, start to finish, with all the parts in the right order and all the details that matter. I'm going to do that now. I'm doing it partly because it's time. I'm 31 years old, and I've been carrying this particular arrangement of events around for 4 years now, and it has gotten lighter but it hasn't gotten gone, and I think telling it all the way through might finish something that's been unfinished since the July I moved out of the house I grew up in with a week's notice and my brother's cheerful suggestion ringing in my ears. I'm also doing it because of what happened after. Because the story doesn't end with the leaving, it ends, or rather it changes key, about a week after the leaving, when my brother stood in our mother's kitchen and screamed. But I need to start earlier than that. Before I start earlier than that, I want to say something about what memory does over 4 years. It compresses some things and expands others. The arguments I remember almost verbatim, the exact words, the exact tone, the exact feeling of air in the room. The quiet stretches I remember and impressions. The smell of the house, the sound of Saturday mornings, the particular quality of light through the kitchen window in late afternoon. I'm going to try to be accurate about both kinds. Where I'm reconstructing, I'll say so. Where I'm certain, I'll just say it. I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. If you don't know Marietta, it's a city north of Atlanta, technically its own city but woven into the metro area the way everything up there is woven into the metro area, a continuous sprawl of subdivisions and strip malls and the occasional older neighborhood that predates all of it and has a different feel, a different scale, trees that have had more time to grow tall. There's a square in the center of town, the old Marietta Square, with restaurants and shops and a bandstand, and in the evenings people walk there the way people in smaller towns walk their downtowns, with the ease of people who know the geography by heart. My family lived in one of those older neighborhoods, off Roswell Street, in a 2-story house that my parents had bought in 1989 when houses in Marietta were still something that a man who managed a hardware supply warehouse and a woman who worked part-time at a pediatrician's office could afford. I have a specific and detailed memory of that house that I carry the way you carry houses you grew up in, not as a series of rooms but as a whole atmospheric thing, a smell and a sound and a quality of light that is entirely specific to that structure and those years. The kitchen had yellow walls that my mother chose in 1994 and never changed, which I used to find embarrassing and now find comforting. The backyard had a long garden bed along the fence where my father grew tomatoes every summer, and at the back corner of the yard there was a sweet gum tree with roots that had started pushing up the concrete of the old patio, which had been something my father said he was going to deal with every year since approximately 2001 and had not dealt with. There was a porch across the front of the house with 2 wicker chairs that were always there but rarely sat in except in the spring, when the Bradford pear trees on Roswell Street bloomed and the air had that particular smell that is Georgia spring, sweet and slightly bacterial and unmistakably itself. I loved that house. I want to say that clearly, before I say everything else. I loved it the way you love something you've always had and have never needed to imagine losing. My father's name is Gary Delaney. He's 63 now, retired from the warehouse, spends a lot of time with his tomato garden in the backyard and watching the Atlanta Braves, which he has done my entire life with the devoted inconsistency of a man who loves a team that regularly disappoints him. He's not a bad man. I want to say that clearly at the start, because the story involves him making a decision that was not good, and I don't want to skip over the fact that bad decisions and not being a bad person can coexist in the same person, and often do. My mother is Pamela Delaney, Annie Kasowski. 61, recently stopped working at the pediatrician's office to help look after my brother's kids. She has a voice that is almost permanently set to gentle, which can be a genuine quality and can also be a way of declining to commit to positions. I have spent my adult life trying to figure out which it is, and I've landed on It's both, depending on the situation. She loves both her children. That's real. What she struggles with is acting on that love when it creates conflict with anyone else. My brother is Scott Delaney. He's 35 now. 2 years older than me, which was always relevant in the ways 2 years is relevant between siblings, long enough for him to have established patterns, claimed territories, constructed hierarchies that I was born into and spent 27 years navigating. Scott is handsome and easy to like when things are going his way. He tells good stories, he makes people laugh, he has a quality of assuming the world will cooperate with him that comes across as confidence and mostly gets results. He married a woman named Bridget Holcomb in March of that year, Bridget, who grew up in Alpharetta and has opinions about everything delivered with the certainty of someone who has never had her opinions seriously challenged. I am Rachel. 27 at the time this starts. I had a bedroom in the house I grew up in because I'd moved back 18 months before after a bad breakup and a job situation that required some financial stabilization. This is not an unusual story, more people my age have done some version of this than the cultural narrative about adult children moving home would have you believe. I was paying my parents $300 a month. I was helping around the house, genuinely helping, not performatively. Cooking several nights a week, mowing the lawn in the rotation with my dad, helping my mother with the grocery runs, doing whatever needed doing because I understood that I was a guest in their home and guests who are also family need to earn the easy chair they're sitting in. I had a job. I worked as a project coordinator at a mid-size commercial real estate firm with offices on Cumberland Parkway in Marietta. It was not glamorous work, but I was good at it and I was building something, slowly, with intention, the way you build when you've had a setback and you're being careful this time. I had savings. I was looking for apartments. I had a spreadsheet, honestly, a spreadsheet with columns for rent and commute time and proximity to the gym on Powder Springs Street where I went 4 mornings a week. I was not, in other words, a problem. I was a temporary resident who was being responsible about being temporary. My brother's wedding changed the math in ways nobody told me they were changing. Scott and Bridget got married on a Saturday in March at a venue out on Cherokee Street in Marietta, a converted cotton mill that did weddings and corporate events, the kind of place that photographs beautifully and costs accordingly. The wedding was nice. I was a bridesmaid, which I had agreed to because saying no would have required an explanation I didn't want to give, and which involved a dress in a shade of dusty rose that I have not worn since. Bridget has 2 sisters and 2 close friends from her sorority at Georgia State who were also bridesmaids, and the 5 of us had been cheerfully herded through fittings and a bridal shower at a restaurant in Buckhead that cost more per person than my weekly grocery budget. None of this is the point. The point is the reception, and specifically a conversation I had with my mother near the end of it, while the DJ was playing something from the 90s and the older relatives were finding their coats. My mother pulled me aside. She had the look she gets when she's delivering news she wishes someone else had delivered. She said, "I want you to hear this from me, Rach. Scott and Bridget are going to move in with us. Just for a while they save for their house. Your father and I think it makes sense." I looked at her. I said, "Where would they sleep?" She said, "We thought they'd take the master guest room. The big one in the back." The house had 4 bedrooms. My parents' room, my room, a smaller guest room that nobody really used, and a larger rear-facing room with its own bathroom that had historically been called the master guest room and which was, to be accurate about it, a nicer room than mine. Larger, better light, the private bathroom. I said, "Okay, so they'd have the back room. And I'd be in my room." My mother's face did something complicated. She said, "We'll talk about it later. Tonight is for celebrating." I had the particular feeling of understanding something before I'd been told it. The conversation happened 3 weeks after the wedding. My father asked me to come downstairs after dinner, and both he and my mother were sitting at the kitchen table, and Scott was on video call on my father's iPad propped against the fruit bowl, because he and Bridget were still technically in their apartment in Kennesaw. My father is not a man who softens things unnecessarily. He said, "Rachel, when Scott and Bridget move in, we need to talk about the room situation. The way we see it, you can take the small guest room, or this might be a good time for you to look at moving into your own place." That's almost exactly what he said. I remember it with unusual clarity, the way you remember the sentences that rearrange things. Take the guest room or move out. I looked at the iPad. Scott was on the screen. He was smiling, not a cruel smile, just the smile of someone who had already decided how this was going to go and was comfortable with the outcome. He said, "Better if you're gone by tomorrow." He said it cheerfully. That's the part that has stayed with me most specifically, not that he said it, but the tone of it. Like it was a joke that also happened to be true. Like the displacement of his sister from her home was a mildly amusing logistical matter that would sort itself out. My mother said, "Scott," in the way she says things when she wants to acknowledge that something was not ideal without actually addressing it. My father looked at the table. I said, "Okay." Again. That word. I think when things hit us in a certain way, before the feelings arrive, the only sound we can make is okay. It's not agreement. It's the sound of the mind buying time while everything else catches up. I went upstairs and sat on my bed and looked at my room. I'd been in that room since I was 9 years old. It had been many things: a child's room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that were still faintly visible in the right light, a teenager's room with banned posters and the desk where I'd done homework for 8 years, a young adult's room in my mid-20s, and then the room of a woman in her late 20s recalibrating. It had always been mine. The particular smell of it, the way the morning light came through the east-facing window, the creak of the floorboard just inside the door that I'd learned to step over so I didn't wake anyone coming in late. Scott wanted me gone by tomorrow. I started looking for apartments that night. I did not leave by tomorrow. I want to be clear about that. I left when I had a place to go, which took 10 days. Those 10 days were their own particular kind of experience. Scott and Bridget moved in on the second day. They'd already been packed, I realized, and suddenly the house that had been mine and my parents' for 18 months was full of Bridget's decorative pillows and Scott's golf equipment and the particular charge of a couple newly married and exercising their sense of ownership over a space that had been promised to them. Bridget was not unkind to me directly. She was something more interesting than unkind. She was indifferent. She moved through the house as if I had already gone. She reorganized the pantry on day 3, which was something I found out when I came downstairs and couldn't locate the coffee. She had opinions about the throw on the living room couch. She asked my mother, within my earshot, whether the guest bathroom, which was the bathroom closest to my room, the one I used, could be redone at some point because it was a little dated. I found my apartment on day 6. It was in a complex called Creekside View, off Franklin Road in Marietta, one of those decent mid-range complexes with a pool that's nice in summer and a gym that's functional if not inspiring. The unit was a one-bedroom on the second floor with a small balcony that faced west, and the afternoon light on that balcony was unexpectedly nice, and I stood on it during the tour and thought, I can live here. I can make this mine. I signed the lease on day 8. I moved on day 10. My father helped me carry boxes. He showed up with his truck and his quiet, which is how he communicates things he doesn't have words for, and we loaded the truck in 2 trips. He didn't say much during the loading. He was methodical about it, the way he is about physical tasks, putting things in the truck bed with the careful geometry of a man who has moved a lot of things in his life and knows how to make them fit. I watched him lift the bookshelf that had been in my room since college and carry it to the truck with an ease that suggested it weighed much less than it looked, and I thought about how much of my life this man had carried for me in ways that didn't get named, and about how that carrying was currently in direct tension with the fact that he'd told me to take the guest room or leave. People are not one thing. I've been thinking about that more than anything else, over the years since this happened. At the end, when the truck was empty and we were standing in my new living room surrounded by my things in their unfamiliar new arrangement, my father looked around the apartment for a moment. He looked at the balcony. He looked at the kitchen, which was small but had good counter space. He looked at the bedroom door, which I'd propped open with a box. He said, "You'll be okay, Ratch." I said, "I know, Dad." He stood there for another moment, like he wanted to say something else. Then he nodded once, the way he nods when a decision has been made and there's nothing more to say about it. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, my father's version of a long embrace, and then he left. My mother had hugged me for a long time at the door of the old house before my father and I drove away. She smelled like the herbal shampoo she'd been using my entire life, something with rosemary in it, and I pressed my face into her neck for a moment in the way I hadn't done since I was maybe 8 years old, and she held me with both arms very tight. She didn't say anything during the hug. After, she stepped back and looked at me and her eyes were very bright and she said, "Call me." I said, "I will." Scott and Bridget were not home when I left. I don't know if they were out or just upstairs. I don't know if it was a deliberate absence or a coincidence. I didn't ask. I drove away from the house on Roswell Street with my father's truck ahead of me and I made myself look in the rearview mirror just once, at the house getting smaller in the distance, the 2 wicker chairs on the front porch, the Bradford pear tree in the yard, and then I didn't look back again. I drove to Creekside View and carried the rest of my boxes up the stairs by myself and put things in approximately the right places and then sat on the floor of my new living room, because my couch wasn't scheduled to be delivered until the next day, and I ordered a pizza from a place on Whitlock Avenue, a neighborhood spot that a coworker had recommended, thin crust, simple, exactly right, and ate it sitting on the floor and told myself I was fine. I was mostly fine. The mostly was doing a lot of work. What I was also doing, sitting on that floor, was something I've only understood in retrospect. I was accepting it. Not in the sense of thinking it was okay, but in the sense of recognizing it as real, as done, as the thing that had happened. You can spend enormous energy arguing with events that have already occurred, and some people do that for a long time, replay the conversation, imagine the different version where you pushed back harder or said the thing you didn't say or refused to go. I've done some of that. But sitting on the floor of my apartment in Creekside View with a pizza box and no furniture, I was also doing the other thing, which is letting it have already happened and asking, "Now what?" Now what turned out to be more than I'd expected. In the best possible way. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that was true in the weeks before I moved out, that I'd been sitting on like a stone in my shoe that I kept thinking I'd deal with later. I knew something about my brother and his wife. I need to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to be dramatic about it, and I don't want to present it as something I handled well when I handled it with more confusion than grace. But here's what I knew. Bridget had a storage unit in Kennesaw. I knew this because I'd helped her move some things in there in February, before the wedding, as a way of freeing up space in the apartment she and Scott shared. The storage unit was at a facility on Moon Station Road, one of those climate-controlled places with the orange doors. I'd gone with her on a Saturday morning, helped her move boxes labeled with her name in black marker. About 2 weeks after the wedding, I was driving back from a friend's birthday dinner and I passed the storage facility and saw Bridget's car in the lot. It was 11 at night. I slowed down because I was surprised, and then I drove on, because it wasn't my business. But then a week later, this was while I was still in the house, while Scott and Bridget had just moved in, I overheard a phone call. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was walking past the master guest room with a basket of laundry and the door wasn't fully closed and Bridget's voice was clear and carrying, and what I heard was, "It's all there, I moved everything in February." He doesn't know. I stopped walking. Then I kept walking, because the alternative was standing in the hallway holding laundry outside my sister-in-law's door, and I didn't have a plan for what came next. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about what it might mean. I thought about the storage unit, the late-night visit, the boxes with her name. It's all there. He doesn't know. I constructed theories and dismissed theories and landed on the most likely theory, which was that Bridget had been moving money or assets, savings, valuables, something, into a unit that Scott didn't know about. That she had been doing this before they were married. That there was a dimension of the financial situation in their marriage that Scott had no visibility into. I am not a lawyer. I don't know precisely what the legal implications of that are. What I know is that it felt wrong. What I know is that it was my brother, who had cheerfully told me to be gone by tomorrow, but who was still my brother, and who was in a marriage with a woman who was possibly hiding things from him before the ink on their license was dry. I didn't know what to do. I made the wrong choice, which was to leave without saying anything, because I told myself it wasn't my business, because I was angry about being displaced and I didn't want that anger to contaminate what might be legitimate information, and because honestly, I'm going to be honest, I thought that the correct path was to let things play out. I thought. He's a grown man. I thought. They're newly married. I thought. Maybe it's nothing. It was something. My first week in the Creekside View apartment was the week I learned what it means to build a life from scratch in a place that's entirely yours. I don't mean this triumphantly. I mean it in the most literal, practical sense. I had to figure out where the closest grocery store was, a Kroger on South Marietta Parkway, which was a 10-minute walk or a 3-minute drive, and I alternated depending on how ambitious I felt, and which way the morning light fell, east, through the bedroom window, very nicely, the kind of light that makes you think better of whatever day is starting, and where to put the couch when it arrived, against the east wall, which I changed after 2 days to against the south wall, which was better and is where I should have put it immediately if I'd trusted my instincts more. I had to figure out the sounds. New apartment sounds are a specific kind of learning curve. Every building has its own language, its own schedule of creaks and hums and the particular noise the HVAC makes when it kicks on, the sounds from above and below and beside. My upstairs neighbor had an energetic morning routine that involved what sounded like extensive movement around 6:30 am, which I eventually determined was probably yoga or some kind of floor-based exercise, and which became just background after a week. The complex had a pool, and on evenings when it was still warm, and Georgia evenings are warm deep into September, I'd hear the sound of the water and voices from the pool area, which was not unpleasant. It sounded like summer going on without me, and I was fine with that. I'd join it eventually. I had to sit alone in the evenings, which is a different thing than being alone in a room in a house where other people are. The silence of a new apartment that is entirely yours has a particular quality. It can be peaceful. It can be terrible. Those first evenings it was both in rapid alternation, sometimes within the same hour. I was talking to my friend Simone most nights. Simone Babcock, we'd been friends since freshman year at Georgia State. She'd moved back to the Atlanta area after some years in Charlotte and was living in Decatur now, and she was one of maybe 3 people who knew the full situation with my family. She would call around 8 and we'd talk while I was unpacking, which she was nominally helping with by being on the phone. She had a talent for making serious things feel slightly less serious without diminishing them, which is a gift and a rare one. She said, on day 4, "Do you think you're going to tell Scott about the Bridget thing?" I said, "I don't know what the Bridget thing is." She said, "You know it's a thing." I said, "I know it felt like a thing." She said, "Rachel." I said, "I know." I hadn't told my parents. I hadn't told anyone except Simone. I was holding it the way you hold things that don't have a clear action attached to them, carefully, at a slight distance, trying to figure out what to do with them. On day 7, I didn't have to figure it out anymore. My mother called on a Thursday evening. I was making dinner, pasta with the Jared sauce I'd bought at the Kroger because I hadn't gotten around to cooking anything real yet, standing at the stove in the kitchen of my new apartment on Franklin Road, and her name came up on my phone and I answered and her voice had the specific quality I'd learned to recognize over 31 years as "Something has happened." She said, "Rachel, I need to tell you something before you hear it another way." I turned the stove down. She said, "Scott found some paperwork in the house. He found some paperwork he wasn't supposed to find, and it's related to Bridget and some financial things. And he's very upset." I said, what kind of paperwork? She said, it seems like Bridget had an account that Scott didn't know about. And a storage unit with some things in it. And, Rachel, she's apparently been moving money since before the wedding. He found a bank statement and some other documents. In the desk. The desk he brought from their apartment in Kennesaw. He was looking for a warranty card for something and went through the back drawers and found it. In the back of a desk drawer. She'd left it somewhere she thought he wouldn't look. Or she'd planned to move it and hadn't gotten around to it. Some version of events where a careful plan had one loose thread that finally pulled. I sat down on my new couch, which had arrived 2 days earlier and which I was still getting used to. The cushions were firmer than I'd expected when I'd ordered it online, and I kept meaning to add a softer pillow to the left end. I said, how much money? My mother said, we don't know all of it yet. Scott is beside himself. She paused. He found the paperwork in the desk and he confronted Bridget right there in the living room, and she didn't deny it. She started explaining, and Scott, she stopped. I said, Mom. She said, he came downstairs and he was shaking. I've never seen him like that, Rachel. He's 35 years old and he was shaking. He said, Mom, Rachel knew about this, and I said, what do you mean? And he said he'd found something else. A note. Apparently there was a handwritten reminder note that Bridget had written herself, about the Moon Station Road unit. And the note mentioned your name. Something about a visit in February. And Scott, she stopped again. I said, what did Scott do? My mother said, very carefully, in the deliberate way she uses when she's reporting something she's still processing. He screamed. He stood in the kitchen and he screamed. He said, she's lying, she knew, Mom, tell me she's lying. I sat on my couch and looked at the wall of my apartment and thought about February. A Saturday morning, the storage facility on Moon Station Road, the orange doors, the parking lot, Bridget carrying boxes and making conversation about how much she was looking forward to having more space once she and Scott were settled. The phone call through the not quite closed door 2 months later. It's all there. He doesn't know. My brother had screamed at my mother to tell him I was lying. He needed a place to put the feeling, and I was the available surface. I was the person who'd helped Bridget that Saturday in February, whose name was on a note, who had apparently known something. The alternative, that his wife had orchestrated this before the wedding was even over, was too large to look at directly. So he looked at me instead. I understand this. I understand it now, anyway. In the moment, I just felt very tired. I took a breath. I said, Mom. I'm going to tell you what I know. I told her everything. The storage unit visit in February, what I'd seen. The phone call through the door, what I'd heard. The 3 days of sitting on it and not knowing what to do and making the wrong call, which was to say nothing. My mother was quiet through all of it. When I was done, she said, Rachel, why didn't you tell someone? I said, I didn't know what I'd actually seen. I didn't know if it was anything. She said, but you suspected. I said, yes. I suspected. She was quiet again. Then she said, okay. I need to go talk to your father. She hung up. I sat for a moment and then called Simone, because I needed to say what had happened out loud to someone who would help me process it rather than need me to manage their reaction. Simone picked up on the second ring and I told her, and she said, very quietly, oh, Rachel. Which was exactly right. Just those 2 words. Just acknowledgement. Just. Yes, this is a lot, and I'm here. I said, he screamed at my mom that I was lying. Simone said, he's in shock. He's going to need someone to blame first before he can accept what actually happened. I said, I know. I said, he told me to leave my house. Simone said, I know. She stayed on the phone with me for 2 hours that night. We ordered food, she got delivery to her place in Decatur, I got delivery to mine in Marietta. We were technically eating dinner together via FaceTime, which is the kind of thing you do when your friend is the person you need and she's 14 miles away. She had Thai food and I had a burger from a place on Atlanta Road, and we ate and talked, and the situation didn't resolve, but it became something I could hold better. Scott called me the next morning. Early, 7:15, which meant he'd been up for a while. I was still in bed when my phone went and I saw his name and lay there for a moment deciding whether to answer, and answered. He said, "Rachel." His voice had a particular quality I didn't recognize immediately because I'd never heard it before. My brother's voice is usually easy, the voice of a man who expects rooms to be on his side. This was different. This was stripped of that ease. What was underneath was younger, rawer, and it reminded me of him at 13 when our dog died, the way his voice had broken then, and I'd forgotten that version of him existed. He said, "Did you know?" I said, "I knew something." I didn't know how to be sure. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Scott, you told me to leave my house by tomorrow." Silence. I said, "I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm saying that as context. Things were complicated between us and I didn't know how to bring it to you, and I made the wrong call, and I'm sorry that I didn't figure out a way." More silence. He said, "How much do you think there is?" I said, "I don't know. I only saw what I saw." He said, "She had almost $40,000. In a separate account. Since October. October. They'd gotten engaged in September. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. $40,000 moved over 6 months. The storage unit. The late night visit. He said, "Her name is on everything. Everything we moved into the house, the furniture, it was bought with her money. But the credit card debt is joint. We opened a joint card in January and she's been running it up since March." I said, "Scott, you need a lawyer." He said, "I know." He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, in that stripped-down voice that was 13 years old and grieving a dog, "She did this before we were married." I said, "I know." He said, "I screamed at Mom. I said you were lying." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I'm sorry, Rachel. I am going to say something about that apology that I want to be careful about. It was real. I believe it was real. When you have known a person your whole life, you know the difference between the real things and the performed things, and that apology was the former. He was sorry. He was also shattered, and the shattering was covering the sorry and making it come out small, but it was there. I said, "Thank you for calling." He said, Can we talk? Actually talk? I said, "Yeah. We can talk." We talked. Not that day, and not easily. What happened over the next weeks and months was less a conversation and more a slow excavation of the situation with Bridget, which turned out to be more complicated than even the first accounting suggested, and of everything else, the longer history of being siblings and what we'd done with that and what we'd made of it. Bridget and Scott's marriage did not survive. I'm not going to go into all the details because they're not entirely mine to go into. It was Scott's marriage and Scott's humiliation and Scott's recovery, and the specific map of that territory belongs to him. What I'll say is that they separated within 2 months of the discovery. There were lawyers involved, the storage unit was eventually documented and disclosed, and whatever was in those boxes with Bridget's name on them in black marker found its way into an accounting of assets that mattered legally. Scott moved out of my parents' house in September. He rented a place in East Cobb, near the Chattahoochee River, a 2-bedroom that he said felt enormous for one person and that he slowly adjusted to. We had dinners sometimes, him and me, at a restaurant on Roswell Road in Marietta that we'd been going to since we were teenagers, a neighborhood Italian place that had changed owners twice but kept the same menu, the same red vinyl booths, the same bread basket that comes automatically when you sit down. We ate bread and talked about things that were real, and I learned, slowly, that my brother had a layer underneath the easy surface that I'd never had access to before, and that layer was someone I actually liked. I want to be clear. I don't tell this story to make myself the hero of it. I didn't handle the storage unit information well. I waited too long. I made a passive choice when an active choice was probably better, and that passive choice had consequences that I have to own. The fact that the reason I sat on it was partly because of the anger and hurt of being told to leave my home, that's context, not absolution. What I will say is this. I moved out. I built something in that apartment in Creekside View that was mine. I learned what my life felt like when I wasn't a guest in it, when the space was entirely and unambiguously mine, and that turned out to be worth knowing. My apartment at Creekside View became home in the way that places become home when you've needed them. Not immediately, those first weeks were transitional, the particular unsettled feeling of a space that has your things in it but doesn't feel like yours yet. The smell is wrong until it's right. The sounds are unfamiliar until they aren't. There's a period of adjustment that's uncomfortable, and then there's the morning you wake up and the light is coming through the window in its particular way and you recognize it as your light, your window, your morning, and you exhale something you've been holding. That morning came about a month in, on a Saturday in August. I woke up and the sun was coming through the bedroom blinds in those warm angled lines that mornings do in summer, and I lay there and listened to the sounds of the complex, someone on another balcony, a car door, the distant hum of the Braves game on someone's television, which is a sound that is foundational to any Georgia summer, and I thought, this is mine. Not borrowed, not temporary, not navigated around the schedules and preferences of people whose home it more genuinely was. Mine. I got up and made coffee. I'd bought a French press, which I'd always wanted but hadn't had room for in my parents' pantry, and I took it out on the balcony that faced west and looked at the parking lot and the trees beyond the parking lot and the early blue of the Saturday sky, and I thought about everything that had gotten me there. I thought about my father at the kitchen table and the iPad propped against the fruit bowl and Scott's cheerful face on the screen. Better if you're gone by tomorrow. I thought about Bridget reorganizing the pantry on day 3. I thought about the storage unit on Moon Station Road with the orange doors and the boxes labeled in black marker. I thought about my brother's voice, stripped of its easy surface, saying, "She did this before we were married." I thought about dinner at the Italian place on Roswell Road, the red vinyl booths, the bread basket that comes automatically. I thought about Dr. Carla Whitman on Peachtree Road, who I'd started seeing in my second month at Creekside View, who had a way of asking questions that made you look at things from an angle you hadn't thought of. She'd asked me once, in our third session, "When you imagine the version of you that's fully okay, where is she? What does she look like?" I'd said, "She's on a balcony somewhere. With good coffee. And it's hers." Dr. Whitman had said, "What would you need to get there?" I'd said, "I think I'm already there. I just haven't recognized it yet." She'd written something in her notebook. Then she'd looked up and said, "Then recognize it." My parents and I found our way back to something that felt real over the course of that year. My father called me the Sunday after everything came out about Bridget. He called and he said, "Rachel." And then he said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Dad, you don't." He said, "Let me say it. I should have. I made a decision that put your brother's situation ahead of yours, and it was wrong. You were responsible and you were paying your way and you didn't deserve to be pushed out. And I should have said that at the time instead of just expecting you to accept it. My father is not a man who says those things easily. I know what it costs him." I said, "Thank you, Dad." And I meant it fully. He said, "Are you okay out there?" I said, "I'm actually really good." He said, "Good." And then, "The Braves are on tonight if you want to watch." I said, "I'll come over." And I went over to the house on Roswell Street in Marietta and sat on the couch with my father, the same couch I'd grown up on, the same lamp in the corner, the same creak of the floors, and we watched the Braves play, and my mother brought us the little plate of crackers and cheese she always makes when there's a game, and we didn't talk about Scott or Bridget or the summer of the displacement, we just watched baseball. And the ease of it was the most normal thing I'd felt in months. My brother and I had a harder conversation, later, about the wedding at the cotton mill on Cherokee Street and the conversation I'd had with my mother near the end of the reception and what she'd known and when. She cried, which is not something my mother does often. She has always been a person who keeps her feelings near the surface but controlled, visible but managed, and crying represents a loosening of that control that is significant for her. I let her cry and didn't try to stop it because sometimes people need to cry their way through the thing they're acknowledging. When she was done, she said, "I should have stood up for you more. I always do that. I let the current carry me and I end up where the current takes me instead of where I actually want to be." I said, "I know, Mom. I know." She said, "I'm working on it." I said, "Me too." We were quiet for a moment. We were in the kitchen of the house on Roswell Street, the yellow walls, the particular smell of the place, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at my whole life, and my mother was across from me with a crumpled tissue and red eyes and the expression of a woman who has been honest about something she'd been carrying for a while. She said, "You were always so capable. I used to think that was the same as being okay." I said, "It's not." She said, "I know that now." I said, "I know you do." We ate lunch after, because it was past noon and neither of us had said anything about food, and suddenly we were both hungry. My mother made sandwiches, the same kind she'd made when I was in middle school, turkey and Swiss and a specific mustard that is apparently still available at the Kroger on South Marietta Parkway because she's been buying it for 30 years. We ate sandwiches at the yellow-walled kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, and the ordinariness of it was a kind of landing, a way of returning to each other after the harder conversation, and I drove home to Creekside View afterward feeling lighter than I had in months. I want to say something about the Bridget situation that I haven't said yet, which is this. I don't hate her. I know that might surprise you. She helped displace me from my home, her financial scheming blew up my brother's marriage, her casual indifference in those 10 days in the house on Roswell Street made me feel like I'd already ceased to exist. None of that is small. But I'd done enough work, with Dr. Whitman, on my own, in the time and space that a life that's finally mine provides, to understand that most people who do damaging things are doing them from a place of fear or scarcity or an old wound that hasn't healed. Bridget had something she was afraid of losing. She was a year into a relationship with a man who had the ease of a man who expects rooms to be on his side, and she was building a protection around herself before she even walked down the aisle. That protection took a form that was wrong. The form it took hurt my brother and had ripple effects on my family. But I understand, in a way I couldn't have without the year I had, that fear makes people small and sneaky in ways they can't always see from inside it. I haven't spoken to Bridget since. I don't know that I will. But I don't carry her as an enemy, which is a choice I made deliberately and which was not easy but which has served me. Scott met someone new in the fall of the year after his divorce was finalized. Her name is Vanessa, she's from Smyrna, she works as a pediatric nurse at Wellstar Kennestone Hospital and she has the warmest laugh I've ever heard from a person. She laughs at things with her whole body. Scott is different with her, not changed exactly, but like he's been given permission to be a version of himself that was always there and never quite got out. I've had dinners with both of them, at the Italian place on Roswell Road, and it's good. Different from the siblings at dinner of the red vinyl booths and the excavation period, different in the way that good things are different, easier, warmer, taking up more air in a room rather than less. At one of those dinners, Scott said something I want to record here because I've thought about it a lot since. We were on our second glass of wine, Vanessa was telling a story about something that had happened at the hospital, and in a pause in the story Scott looked at me and said, "I'm glad you're okay, Ratch." He didn't elaborate. He didn't frame it or explain it. Just, "I'm glad you're okay." And in those 5 words was everything that the harder conversations had been trying to say, boiled down to its actual content. He saw what had happened. He knew what I'd navigated. He was glad I was okay. I said, "I'm glad you are too." Vanessa looked between us with the expression of someone who understands she's witnessing something private and has the grace to hold space for it without interrupting. She's good people. I've thought that since the first time I met her, and I think it more every time. I moved out of Creekside View after 2 years. The apartment had done its job, which was to be the place where I first understood what my life felt like when it was entirely mine. I'd made it mine in all the small ways. A gallery wall of prints I'd collected, including one from a local Atlanta artist I'd found at a market in Inman Park, a kitchen that I'd stocked with things I actually liked, and a French press that made the coffee I actually wanted, a balcony with 2 chairs and a small table, and a trailing plant that had somehow thrived despite my inconsistent attention. I'd made friends in the complex, a woman named Teresa on the 3rd floor who had a dog named Earl and who I'd started walking with on Saturday mornings, and a couple in the unit adjacent to mine who had me over for dinner enough times that we'd graduated to the comfortable kind of friendship where you don't need a specific occasion. But after 2 years I wanted something different, a neighborhood with more walking, closer to the city, more of a life outside the apartment to step into when I stepped outside. I wanted the feeling of a neighborhood that had bones, that had been somewhere for a while. I found a place in the Grant Park neighborhood in Atlanta, a 1-bedroom in a building that had been renovated from an older warehouse-style structure on Boulevard. It's the kind of apartment that has brick walls and high ceilings and windows that are bigger than they have any practical right to be, the kind of windows that change the whole character of a room by the quality and quantity of light they let in. The floors are the original wood, worn smooth in the ways that decades of feet wear wood smooth, and they creak in specific places that I now know by heart. The neighborhood has a particular character that I've come to love with specificity. Grant Park itself, the actual park, the one the neighborhood is named for, is 6 blocks away, and in the mornings before work I sometimes walk through it, past the old houses that face its perimeter, past the people with their dogs and their coffee and their particular morning person energy. Zoo Atlanta is in the park, and sometimes in the early morning if the wind is right I can hear the sounds of it, something between a grunt and a bellow that I've identified as the gorillas, who apparently have things to say early in the morning. The farmers market at the old Morningside location is not in my neighborhood exactly, but I go sometimes. I am still not really a farmers market person, but I like the walk. Sunup Coffee on Memorial Drive has become mine in the way places become yours when you go enough. Marcus knows my order, a medium dark roast, black, with whatever pastry arrived that morning, and he starts it when he sees me come through the door. I've tipped him extravagantly every time I go for 2 years as thanks for this. He once told me his long-term plan is to open his own place someday, in Deckard or maybe Kirkwood, and I have already decided I will be a regular there too. I am happy in Grant Park in a way that has become ordinary, which is the best kind of happy. Not the happiness of relief or of having survived something, which is what my first months at Creekside View felt like, but the ordinary, unremarkable happiness of a life that fits. I wake up and the light comes through those enormous windows and it is mine. I go to sleep and the apartment is quiet in its own particular way and it is mine. I navigate my own mornings and evenings and weekends and make my own decisions about where the couch should go and when to have friends over and whether to cook or order food, and none of these decisions need to pass through another person's preferences first. I got promoted at the commercial real estate firm. I'm a senior project manager now, with a small team that I coordinate and a workload that is challenging in the specific way that good work is challenging, requiring things from you and giving things back. I'm good at it, and I've stopped finding this surprising. Being good at something that earns you a sustainable living is a kind of freedom that takes a while to fully appreciate, but I appreciate it now, with the specific appreciation of someone who remembers when that freedom was not a given. I kept seeing Dr. Whitman on Peachtree Road for 2 years and then tapered off to occasional check-ins. She said, when I told her I thought I was ready to step back from regular appointments, "You were ready a while ago. I've been waiting for you to notice." I thought that was both annoying and exactly right, which is her signature. The occasional check-ins still happen, twice a year or so, And I go in and sit in the chair across from her and we catch up and she asks the questions that make you look at things from angles you hadn't thought of and I leave feeling calibrated in a way that I've learned to value. The Braves games with my father are a thing I look forward to all year. Truist Park, which opened out in Cumberland a few years before all of this happened, has become one of my favorite places. The specific configuration of it, the sight lines, the way the crowd sounds different in the 7th inning when things are close. My father and I go 4 or 5 times a year. We park in the lot on Circle 75 Parkway and walk to the stadium and find our seats and the beer guy comes by and we order and settle in and for 3 hours we are just people watching baseball, 2 people who love the same team and share enough history that the silence between innings doesn't need to be filled. My father is a man of silences. I've learned to be comfortable in them, to understand them as communication rather than absence. The last time we went to a Braves game, late in the summer, he turned to me during the 8th inning. The Braves were up by 2, the crowd had the particular tense quality of people who have been burned enough times to not trust a 2-run lead, and he said, "I'm proud of you, Rachel." Just that. Unprompted, in the 8th inning, with the sound of the crowd around us and the particular stadium light of an August evening in Atlanta. I said, "Thanks, Dad." He turned back to the field. The Braves held the lead. We drove home separately, him north to Marietta and me back to Grant Park, and I drove with the windows down on I-285 and thought about what it had cost him to say that, and felt the weight of it, and felt grateful for it, and let both of those things be true at the same time. The last significant conversation I want to tell you about happened at the Italian restaurant on Roswell Road, just Scott and me, on a fall evening when the air in Marietta had finally gone cool enough to feel like a different season. He'd texted to ask if we could have dinner, just as if that works, and I'd said yes, and we'd met at the old place with the red vinyl booths and ordered our wine and the bread basket came automatically and Scott looked at his glass for a moment before he looked at me. He said, "I want to say something that I've been trying to say for a while and keep not saying right." I said, "Okay." He said, "I told you to leave your house." I said it like it was nothing, he stopped. Like you were nothing. And I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about how you took it, what it must have felt like to have your dad basically say choose the guest room or go, and then have me say be gone by tomorrow. Like a joke. Like it was funny. I said, "It wasn't funny." He said, "I know." He said, "I was so caught up in, Bridget and I had been planning this for months. The move, the setup. She'd been framing it as this great next step and I'd bought into it completely. I'd been telling her about how the house had all this room, how my parents were great about this stuff, and I think I'd already sort of decided you weren't a factor. In my head, I'd erased you. And he shook his head. That's the thing I'm most ashamed of. Not any of the Bridget stuff, not screaming at Mom. That you're my sister and I erased you from the picture because it was convenient." I looked at him. The stripped-down voice was there again, the one that was younger than his actual age, the one without the easy surface. My brother, minus his armor. I said, "I know why you did it. I understand how it happened. I don't think you're a bad person." He said, "You're better at this than me." I said, "I've had more practice." He laughed. Quietly, a little surprised, and then I laughed too, and the laugh broke the tension in the specific way that only happens when both people are ready for it to break. We ate pasta. We drank more wine. We talked about things that were real, the way we'd been slowly learning to do over the previous 2 years. He told me things about the Bridget marriage that I hadn't known, things about how the relationship had felt from inside it, a dynamic that had been off from the start in ways he'd rationalized because he'd been in love, or what he'd understood as love. I told him things about what the displacement had done to me, not accusingly but accurately, because he'd asked and because accuracy felt more useful than softening. He said, toward the end of the evening, "I think if Bridget hadn't done what she did, I might never have looked at any of this. I might have just kept going. Been fine. Never examined anything. I said, the universe is weird like that. He said, the universe is extremely weird. I said, are you okay? He said, yeah. Actually, yeah. And I believed him. There's something amiss. Patterson, actually, no. Wrong story. That's someone else's story. In my story, the person who said the thing I keep returning to is my mother, on a phone call sometime in the spring of the year I moved into Grant Park, when we'd gotten to the place in our relationship where we could talk about what had happened with some distance around it. She said, you know what I've been thinking about? You were fine. The whole time, underneath everything. You were always going to be fine, Rachel. I think I always knew that, and I think that's why. She paused. I think that's why it was easier to push you to manage than to protect you. Because you were the one who could manage. I sat with that for a moment. I said, Mom, that's a reason. It's not a justification. She said, I know. I know that. I said, but I hear what you're saying. And I did hear it. She was saying, I knew you were strong enough to survive this because you'd always been strong enough, and I used your strength as an excuse to not protect it. That's not something a person should do. She knew that. She was naming it because she'd spent a year looking at it and she needed to say it out loud. The strange thing is that it helped. Not because it excused anything, but because it was true and she'd said the true thing clearly, without softening it first, and that was its own kind of step. I said, I am fine. She said, I know. I said, I actually think I'm better than fine. I think I'm where I'm supposed to be. She said, that balcony of yours? I'd sent her a photo of the Grant Park apartment's little deck, a narrow thing that overlooks the courtyard, not as impressive as I'd described it but honest. I said, yeah. That balcony. There's a thing that happens when you've been displaced from something you thought was yours and you find something that is unambiguously, entirely yours. You hold it differently. Not more tightly, necessarily, that's the instinct, but it's not quite right. You hold it more consciously. You notice it. The morning light in the specific way it comes through your window. The particular creak of your floorboard. The way your coffee tastes in your own kitchen, made in your own French press, with the beans from the market 2 blocks over. I notice all of it. I notice it because I know what it costs to not have it. Because I spent 10 days watching my sister-in-law reorganize my parents' pantry and understanding that the house had already moved on from me before I'd left it. Because I spent 3 nights, no, wait. I didn't sleep in a car. I had Simone, and I had enough savings for a deposit, and I had a spreadsheet. I was spared some things other people aren't spared. But I know what it felt like to be told the space you occupied was wanted by someone else and you should make arrangements. I know what it feels like to carry a box down the stairs of a house you grew up in while your father doesn't say the things that would help, and your mother doesn't say them either. I know what it feels like to hear better if you're gone by tomorrow from someone who shared your childhood, and to have that sentence just hanging there in the air, unapologized for in the moment, just cheerfully offered and then left. And I know what it feels like, 7 years later, to be sitting in the Italian restaurant on Roswell Road across from that same person while he says, I erased you. I'm ashamed of that. I'm sorry. I know what both of those feel like, and I know which one I'm still carrying and which one I've been able to set down. I'm Rachel Delaney. I'm 31 years old. I live in Grant Park in Atlanta, in an apartment with brick walls and high windows and a narrow balcony that looks out over a courtyard where in spring there are 2 dogwood trees that bloom white and brief and beautiful. I walk to Sun Up Coffee on weekend mornings and I order the same thing every time, and the guy behind the counter, whose name is Marcus and who has been there for 2 years, knows what it is before I finish ordering. I call my mother on Sundays and she tells me about the pediatrician's office and about Tyler, Scott's son with Vanessa, who arrived last spring and who has Vanessa's laugh already, that full body thing, in miniature. I call my brother on less regular intervals and it's always good, always easier than it used to be, Always a little bit of what it might have been if we'd had different years to practice on. I go to Braves games with my dad. I have a life that is mine. I did not start with it. I had to be asked to leave a place before I understood I could build one. That's often how it works. The thing you needed gets taken or pushed or redirected, and in the space that opens up you discover the thing you actually needed was something you had to make yourself. My father said take the guest room or move out. My brother said better if you're gone by tomorrow. And I moved out, and a week later the thing I knew was sitting behind my sternum finally came forward and made itself known, and my brother stood in the kitchen and screamed, and the whole careful arrangement that had displaced me came apart at the seams. I am not glad that happened to Scott. I want to be clear about that. What Bridget did to him was its own category of damage, and it took him real time and real work to find his way through it. I am not glad it happened. But I will say this. I am glad I moved out. I am glad I had no choice but to find the place on Franklin Road and then the place on Boulevard, and to learn what my life feels like when I'm the only one who decides how the rooms are arranged. I am glad I found Dr. Whitman on Peachtree Road, and the French press and the balcony that is mine, and the coffee shop where they know my order. I am glad I had to build it. Because it turned out, and this is the thing I want to end on, the thing that's been true all along even when I couldn't see it, it turned out I was very good at building things. It turned out that the person my family had found easy to overlook, easy to push aside, easy to suggest be gone by tomorrow, that person could build a life from what she was handed and make it genuinely good. I just needed the room to do it. Atlanta, Georgia, March 2023.